Thank you so much for having me. This has been an honor, a privilege to be here. I had a couple of meetings already earlier today, and got to chat with some of your faculty, so looking forward to meeting some of you later on afterwards as well. And I say this all the time, and then I end up getting super stuffy and serious, but I don't want this to be too serious. I just want this to be a conversation. And you can stop me if you really want to. I'm going to be reading here. So if you have any questions, please, I want this to be open dialogue, but here we go. I want to begin by telling you one of the more vivid examples of my experience as a black man in medicine. An experience that highlights the problems in the field, but also the possibilities of overcoming them. It was during my first surgical rotation as a third-year student at the University of Michigan. As an aspiring surgeon at the time, I wanted to make sure I hit the ground running. So I contacted the chief of the service to find out what I could do to prepare. He suggested that on day one, before our orientation, I show up before rounds to meet the team and be dismissed. Thinking I was going the extra mile, I decided to call the intern to see how he was going to pre-round to find out what I would need to do the next day. He offered to meet me a few minutes before and show me what he was going to do. In an effort to not seem like an undercover gunner, I called my classmates and told them my plan, and one of them decided to join me as well. The intern was late. After several minutes of attempting to reach him, to no avail, he finally called. He told us to print the list and get the numbers. Luckily, at this point, this was not my first clinical rotation, and I had some semblance of an understanding of what that actually meant. So my classmate and I distributed the list and got the numbers. When he finally showed up, there wasn't much time before rounds were to begin. As it turns out, there was a very specific cover sheet that was supposed to go on the rounding list, and the chief liked the list printed and stapled in a very specific fashion and slid underneath his door to his chief's call room before rounds. All of these details were woefully lacking on our list. Before we could right all of our wrongs, the conference room door swings open, and a large Kenyan man that's bald walks into the room. "I start on time," and then walked back out. The intern jumped up and hopped out and followed him, so of course we followed suit. When it was time to present the first patient, the intern slipped behind us, making it brutally obvious that he was expecting us to present these patients. Taken aback by this move, but feeling prepared to be an excellent first impression, I began. Mrs. Smith is a 36-year-old woman post-op day 3 status post-parathyroidectomy. As I made my way through the presentation, reading her overnight events, her vitals, and lab results, I thought to myself, I got this. Before that feeling could fully settle in, the chief then says, "What is the importance of the chem sticks?" Huh? What is the importance of the chem sticks? I froze. I had no idea what he was even talking about. He then looks to my classmate, "Gabriel, what is the importance of the chem sticks?" No response. He then looks back at me. "Did you research your patient?" My patient? I'm thinking, this guy's patient behind me. I'm not even supposed to be here. And then I said, "No. What happened to come and meet the team and be dismissed?" "Is this your first clinical rotation?" "No." "Do you have access to a computer?" "No." "Well, then what is your excuse for not having researched your patient?" I had no words. This process continued for every patient that we rounded on that morning until we were finally dismissed. Later that week, I was scrubbing in next to that same chief when he growled, "Wars have been fought over water." Taking a quick second to process what the heck he had actually just said, I then looked and realized that he had turned his water off while he was scrubbing and mine was still running. So I shut my water off, but then I quickly thought, "Bruh, can I live? I can't even wash my hands right in front of you." A few days later, that chief pulls me aside and he explained the treatment. He could tell that I wanted to get ahead on the surgical rotation. He also knew that I needed to be 10 times better to be seen as half as good, something that he had experienced all too well, and in his progression from black student to black resident to one of the only black chief residents. He was doing it because he knew that if I was to have any chance at being successful in that world, he would need to hold me to a higher standard. Was it unfair and unreasonable of him to expect that I would know anything about those patients that I wasn't even supposed to see? Absolutely. But he was teaching me that at times, even despite my best efforts, I will be told that I am wrong, I will not get the credit I deserve, and I will be viewed as inferior than my peers. Therefore, the better I do, the harder it will be for anyone to find fault in my work. There you have an example of the black male experience in academic medicine. It requires resiliency from the men who are pursuing a medical career. But I want to suggest to you that it also requires resiliency from their classmates, their faculty, their institutions, and their communities, and the larger society in the United States in order to solve an enormous and unique problem. The shocking fact is that, as you've seen here today, the number of men that are applying to and enrolling in medical school has only recently reached levels of 40 years ago. And I'm talking raw numbers, not percentages. In 1978, 1,410 black men applied to medical school, and 542 were enrolled, the most since 2015, when 556 enrolled. Last year, and then this year, it was 572. Remember, this is at a time when more black men are earning undergraduate degrees than they were in 1978. It's just that they're not pursuing medicine in the same proportions. It is also at a time where in the United States, we are headed towards where there will not be an ethnic majority, and the diversity in the profession has been even more vital. Not just for underrepresented minority populations, but for everyone. We are expecting a shortfall of physicians in somewhere between 46,000 to 90,000 by 2025. And if we need a pipeline in a profession that includes and serves the whole society. A 2015 study by the AAMC, as we've heard, called Altering the Course of Black Men in Medicine, conducted extensive interviews of 11 pre-medical students, physicians, researchers, and leaders. They identified a range of factors: lack of role models, inadequate information about medical school and funding. And while anyone who knows me or my family knows that my Nigerian heritage makes it such that there's no question about what is a suitable profession. You're pretty much either a doctor or an engineer or not a son of the family anymore. But my own experience is still proof that by addressing some of those issues, we can empower young black men and women to become physicians. I, too, have had to deal with racial stereotypes in life. In fact, from African Americans as well as from my white classmates. And I've had to learn even more resiliency as an African American man with a disability since my diving accident about 5 years ago. But my story is about what makes it possible to achieve that dream, despite whatever obstacles are perceived to be in your way, self-inflicted or externally imposed. I've experienced disparities in the healthcare system as both an African American and as a person with a disability, and as both a patient and a provider. Like all disparities in society and life, they result from an imbalance in representation. Minorities of any kind are treated less effectively because there aren't as many of them. Their circumstances are not well understood, and their well-being is not as valued. On one level, this disparity is understandable. It seems more efficient to place one's attention and resources where they can benefit the most people. And minorities, by definition, are not most people. But when we're talking about human beings, and especially about the health of human beings, this is a very bad measure. We are all members of a society, and failure to care for any part weakens the whole. This is true on the most concrete and practical level. Poor health in one group dramatically increases the risk that health problems will spread to the entire group. How is it anything but straightforward and a matter of self-interest and self-protection to ensure that one lives in a society where diseases are cured and everyone is healthy? Beyond that, the equal treatment of minorities is a foundational principle of America. We are, as Lincoln said, quoting the Declaration of Independence, all created equal. In this moment between the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday and Black History Month, it's worth recalling that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That includes injustice in healthcare. My life so far has been about dealing with difference and seeking inclusion for myself and others. I'm the son of two physicians who first trained in Nigeria before moving to the United States to further their education. eventually establishing their practices in South Bend, Indiana. I went to Stanley Clark School, a terrific private school, where I was one of the only black students in the entire preschool through 8th grade. At the time, I did not appreciate any significant difference in my treatment because of my race. In fact, in an essay I wrote, "My school is a safe place where no one really cares the color of the skin or the way you wear your hair." I went on to Deerfield Academy for high school, a prestigious college prep school in Massachusetts. But it was there for the first time that I began to realize that some viewed my difference as inferior. I had been in the talented and gifted program in my public school, started attending private school in 4th grade, and was the son of 2 physicians. Yet I was surrounded by a level of wealth and privilege that left me feeling like a second-class citizen. Years later, I recall having conversations with my parents about their own experiences when they first realized that merely working hard and treating others with respect did not always result in equal treatment in return. They shared stories of the times when they were both repeating residency training in the States after having already done so in Nigeria, and not being able to recognize when they were blatantly being discriminated against, because the notion that someone would treat them differently solely on the basis of the color of their skin was a foreign concept to them. It was in those 4 years of high school that I realized being black meant I was supposed to look, act, sound, feel, and dress a certain way. Up to that point, I felt like I'd been treated and judged by the content of my character, not by the color of my skin. On a tilted playing field, any minority must excel by orders of magnitude in order to be viewed as equal. And while that is a glaring injustice, it is an unfortunate reality. Recognizing this drove me to excellence in the highest ways that I could, in the classroom, in the social and cultural life of my schools, and on the athletic teams I played for. As I wrote in Kaleidoscope, the Deerfield Black Student Coalition's journal, as a junior in high school, I like listening to Dave Matthews, and most of my friends are white. That doesn't mean their whiteness is brushed off on me, or that maybe I don't realize I'm black. The scariest part is that most often when someone called me white, they thought they were paying me a compliment. This just goes to show that some people, white and black, think that blacks were not capable of having the same goals that I had merely because they wanted to. The fact that I had high aspirations is a reflection of my character, not a reflection of my skin color. At Stanford University, among other things, I set out to excel on the track team, stretching my triple jump personal best from a pedestrian sub 47 feet to almost 52 feet. By my junior year, I was elected team captain, broke Stanford's indoor school record, and was once amongst the nation's top 15 jumpers, both professionally and collegiate. I was all conference, all region, and all American. At Stanford, as at Deerfield, I forged my identity in the space between the black and white communities, never feeling fully accepted by either on both sides. I was too much of a nerd for the jocks, but too much of a jock for the nerds. I looked too black for the white people, but acted too white for the black people. My Nigerian name was too difficult for the Americans to pronounce, but my American accent when speaking my native tongue was a source of laughter for some of my people from my country. I successfully ran for president of the sophomore class on a slate with 3 other people, a black woman athlete, a Jewish man, and a white woman. In the process, we defeated a majority black slate, and it was made clear to me that we had not won the black vote. I must admit that at times I felt a bit of you're either for us or against us when it came to the Stanford black community, and I certainly did not feel like I was considered entirely with them. The Black Community Services Center was referred to as the Black House, occasionally drawing accusations of reverse racism. I cannot tell you how many times conversations started like, how would you feel if we had dorms that were mostly white, or a building called the White House where we all got together? Sometimes all I could do was that and laugh at the painful irony of some of those statements by the people that made them. This notion of trying to be a Nigerian in American culture, and an athlete among scholars, and a black person in a predominantly white profession will be the focus of one of the breakout sessions after this talk. I eventually made it to the University of Michigan Medical School, where I continued my approach to attempting to excel in academics, sports, social interactions, and service. And that is where I had that eye-opening lesson from that Kenyan doctor about what it means to be a black man in medicine. I then lost my own physical independence on July 4th, 2013. And my tireless efforts over the past 4 years to regain that have awakened me to the struggles that my own patients face every day, but are seldom the topic of JAMA articles or board review questions. My experience has given me a mission to disabuse disability, to prove that disability does not mean inability. I was hosting a 4th of July gathering at a pool in New Haven, Connecticut, where I was a third-year orthopedic surgery resident. I dove into the pool and struck something, the bottom, the side, someone's leg, we can't be sure, but I was immediately unable to move or feel below my neck. A friend sitting on the pool deck saw my futile efforts to emerge and jumped in and rescued me from drowning. It was immediately apparent to me and to many of my friends who were there, including an assortment of surgical residents from various specialties, that I'd likely suffered a cervical spine injury. Putting to work our advanced trauma life support skills, they rolled me onto my back, stabilized my C-spine, and called 911. It was my team's weekend to cover spine call, which means that another fellow PGY3 orthopedic resident had the unthinkable task of assessing me when I was rolled into the trauma bay. Apparently, my years of befriending everyone in the hospital, from janitor to president, paid off, because I was whisked from the trauma bay to the imaging suites to the OR in record time and was getting operated on in under 2 hours. Another friend of mine was the attending surgeon who did my first surgery, an anterior cervical discectomy and fusion. I had suffered a C6 teardrop fracture and was unable to move or feel anything from the chest down. Had very minimal use of my upper extremities as well. I had some difficulty breathing or mustering enough strength to cough, but was lucky never to require intubation outside of the OR. In my attempts to describe spinal cord injury to people, I think of a highway system. The further down from the brain the accident is, the more accessible exits that still occur. So I could hold my head up, my shoulders worked, my elbows worked, my lungs worked, my diaphragm was initially too weak for deep breaths. I didn't have the strength or dexterity in my hands to pick up a fork or hold a pen, and I couldn't move or feel my legs. People only often think of motor and sensory losses when they think of paralysis, but I'd also lost control of my bowel and bladder function, and I had no proprioceptive sense, which is your body's sense of where it is in space. On July 15th, 5 days after my second surgery, a posterior spinal fusion, I was airlifted to the Rehab Institute of Chicago, which is now the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. I was a terrible patient. As a third-year ortho resident at the time, I knew or thought I knew just enough to be dangerous. And as a former All-American athlete at Stanford, I was determined to regain my independence from this humbling state of helplessness. From my situation on the other side of the stethoscope, I wondered exactly why they needed that blood, and I waited very impatiently for answers. I realize now that that was my attempt to try to hold on to what little control I still had. I did multiple hours of physical therapy and occupational therapy a day, learning to roll over, to sit up on my own, to sit in the bed, to transfer from bed to chair, to catheterize myself, and to manage my own bowel program. I spent entire hour-long therapy sessions trying to put a sock on or thread my shoelaces into my shoe. Once I could tolerate being upright for at least 30 minutes, I was able to use a robotic gait training device called the Lokomat. By then, it had been over 2 months since my injury, and while I was very pleased with the gains I had made, I still had not regained any motor function below my chest. Then suddenly on September 8th, when I was alone in my bathroom, I moved my leg for the first time, and that drastically changed the trajectory of my recovery. I was able to begin working on gait training and therapy. I moved back home, and my parents remodeled our home in South Bend, Indiana to make it accessible for me. And I continued rehab at Memorial Outpatient Therapy Services. I eventually took driver's rehab and learned to drive on my own using hand controls. And I continued to exercise my mind while also exercising my body, and enrolled in a master's degree in engineering, science, and technology entrepreneurship at Notre Dame, which introduced me to the research world in design, healthcare innovation, and technology entrepreneurship. And I worked to create a device to make pedicle screw replacement in spine surgery more accurate and more safe. That degree also led to the development of other technologies and equipment, some of which I continue to use in my own recovery to this day. Even before I finished my master's, I was blessed with the opportunity to return to medicine. and I continued my family medicine residency training at Memorial Hospital in South Bend, where I've had the privilege of delivering babies, returning to the operating room, and caring for patients from all walks of life. I was appointed by the mayor to the County Board of Health. I serve as a vice president of a nonprofit which oversees 2 adaptive sports, and I returned to Notre Dame as a thesis advisor for that same master's degree that I had earned. I wanted to continue pushing the envelope, so I hired a trainer at the hospital gym and transitioned out of conventional therapy. My trainer had no knowledge of what I should or shouldn't be able to do, so he'd simply create a workout, and we'd modify them based on how much additional stability or support I needed. This led me to do a 6-week intensive course in Los Angeles called Project Walk, which is now the Abilities Recovery Center, where I was also able to spend more time with my 6-year-old son, Alexander. While I can't yet run around the way I wanted to, and the way I thought I would with my children, I use scooters and other types of mobility devices to keep up with him. Throughout my rehab, I was eventually able to achieve the goal of walking unassisted across a room. However, the demands of finishing residency and the other things I put on my plate have caused me to fall back in some way, something I cannot let continue to happen. In March of 2015, I lost my father, a well-respected and loved neonatologist, to suicide. And in fact, today would have been his 63rd birthday. While my own physical struggles are easy for others to see visibly, this highlighted the fact to me that not everyone's struggles are visible. I have since considered myself a voice for those that don't have much of one, an advocate for individuals with disabilities, visible or otherwise. My father was an excellent clinician and a compassionate caregiver who left a positive impression on every single patient and family member he interacted with, even when, despite his best efforts, the patients didn't survive. He was a trustworthy, reliable, and dedicated coworker, husband, father, brother, uncle, friend, and son. My father is an example of what one should aspire to be in medicine, man or woman, black or white. Last week, I was the keynote speaker at the University of Alabama Birmingham's Joint Group for Diversity and Schwartz Center Grand Rounds. I led with a very simple but important question. Do people think that having a more diverse physician population is of benefit to the healthcare system? That is a very important question because no one works to fix something that they don't believe is broken. And in particular in academia, until something is published, it doesn't exist. I posed the question and actually solicited answers from the audience. Unsurprisingly, no one was willing to say that they did not believe having a more diverse physician pool would be of benefit to the healthcare system. More specifically, in fact, I asked why they felt having more minority physicians was important. I was given answers such as trust, empathy, patient comfort. People across the board feel it is important to connect with your physician, to feel you can relate to them, to have similar lived experiences. And I agreed with them, but I then challenged them, as I will challenge you today, by acknowledging that I believe what is a very dangerous, slippery slope that we do not want to go down. If we continue to place our focus on the fact that we need more black doctors because care for black people will improve, we're inviting a more public demonstration of something that I and many of my minority physician colleagues already experience. People saying that they do not want to be cared for by someone because they are black, female, or have a disability. It is not that every black patient needs a black doctor, or that every person with a disability needs a physician with a disability. Every patient deserves an empathetic doctor, but that empathy doesn't require the same personal lived experience. Sure, I may be more empathic towards a mother with a dying child now that I have a 6-year-old son. And while I have had the opportunity to deliver many babies, I will never experience giving birth. But that does not mean that I cannot empathize with a family who's lost a loved one or a woman that is in pain. Empathy can be taught and can be caught. My classmates in residency told me that they interacted differently with their African American patients and patients with spinal cord injuries simply because of my presence in the program. A casual dinner time conversation about where I get my wheelchair fixed or my urinary catheters turns into conversations they have with their own patients about things they would not have otherwise known. The medical profession needs an inclusive approach that provides access for people whose presence will heighten everyone's ability to relate to a widely diverse group of patients. We need that for each patient, and we need it in an ever-increasing number now that patients' demographics shift in our diverse, accelerating society. The concept of race in medicine is a particularly complicated one. Study after study shows, as we saw today, that minorities, particularly African Americans, receive less attention and less precise care from providers. And some medical schools have even started including curriculum on unconscious bias to address this fact. This mindset extends beyond the differences in ability to the range of full diversity we encounter in humanity and in ourselves. Each of us is a composite of multiple communities. I represent Africans. I represent Nigerians. I represent African Americans. I represent men. I represent people with spinal cord injuries. I represent people of color. I represent physicians. Every time you leave a good impression with someone, that impacts others in some ways you will never know. Someone will mention that wonderful woman physician or that amazing young Hispanic EMT, and suddenly someone else's prejudices will weaken. When you represent the multiple demographics that you are just by being yourself, you shed light that changes the world. When I roll into a room and see a person in a wheelchair, don't assume that our bond will be forged over our similar wheelchair woes. We may find out that we go to the same church, or play the same instrument, or speak the same foreign language. Diversity of experience cannot be quantified by race alone, but a homogeneous population is by definition not as diverse as it could be. This drive to broad diversity and inclusion has its own evolution, and as a society, we become more and more integrated, and leaders are recognizing that inclusion as a moral imperative, as the right thing to do. Today, commercial and educational institutions are taking the lead with initiatives such as CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion because they recognize the benefits of inclusion for everyone, not just minorities. Diverse classrooms enrich educational experience. Diverse corporate teams are more innovative. However, this brings me to ask yet another challenging and potentially uncomfortable question. How do people feel when they hear the word diversity? I'll answer that for you. People feel threatened. And to be quite honest, the majority white male population that predominates feels as though it's often a direct indictment against them. And I do not blame them. I recently read an article about how some corporate-wide diversity programs were in fact making things worse. There are times where the very efforts towards diversity, health equity, and inclusion seem to be excluding others in the process. I do not believe that the lack of sufficient black men in medicine is the fault of my white male colleagues. But I am saying that if that same colleague can't acknowledge that there is a problem, then we're going to have a much harder time making a change that will benefit the whole, not just some. We know that the word diversity often comes with the belief that we're sacrificing quality for quotas, but that need not be the case. This was Dr. Martin Luther King's insight that propelled the civil rights movement. Everyone is injured by discrimination, and everyone is elevated by inclusion. As I said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This approach grounds action in the recognition of fundamental human equality that has distinguished America from Thomas Jefferson through Abraham Lincoln to Dr. King and down to our day. Dr. King did not call the nation to do something for African Americans. He called the nation to abandon its oppression and recognize their equality. No one is superior to lift up one who is inferior. We are equally human beings who benefit from each other's success and who deserve the tools to achieve our own. That approach preserves each person's full dignity and worth, whether their issue is race, ability, some other feature, or a combination. The struggle for this equality is an ongoing challenge. The arc of history bends towards justice, but it is long. There will be setbacks, and in many ways, we are facing some in the nation today. As I dedicate my life to celebrating differences and demonstrating that different does not mean less than, I'm saying that we're constantly reminded that not everyone holds the same beliefs. As the potential emerges for changing immigration laws, threats to the ADA, and an overall culture of divisiveness, we must continue to uphold America's exceptional foundational idea that all are created equal. As an African American man with a disability, I'm committed to advancing the quest for equality, not just under the law, but in society, and in the hearts and minds of my fellow citizens and human beings, and in the medical profession that I love. Thank you. I was like, 2 minutes of no mic just for like a line. Yeah.
Testing. Nothing?
So we're actually going to take a few questions, just a handful or so before we transition into the breakout session. So these are questions for our keynote speaker. All right, let's get a second one so we can run the aisles, okay? And if you have a question, I'll bring you a mic. Left them all speechless, apparently. So here we go. Hi, Quinn.
So my question is about retention of students into medical school once they're here. Do you have experiences that would suggest there are things that we can do differently within our medical education to better retain a diverse student body?
So that question has been posed to me in different ways, and I don't know if this is where you're coming from it. Oftentimes people feel as though, and this may not be your question, but oftentimes people feel that when we recruit a diverse group of students that at times may not have the same background as the slide showed, that we're setting them up for failure by putting them in a situation in which they may not be prepared to excel. If that's not the question, then I can address them both. But I think that regardless of if it's a diverse student population, retention of medical students is an issue for medical students overall. So whatever it is, and this is the answer that I give when people ask me many questions, is find out what it is. Find out what they're struggling with, right? Because I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to many of those things. And some of the problems may just be that the students aren't studying. I mean, I take full responsibility for the fact that any individual has to take responsibility to do what it takes. Going into medicine is not easy. And therefore, I don't want to... The profession is not for everyone that is not willing to put in the work, right? It should be accessible to everyone, but then it means that you have to work to do so. And that means if you need to stop doing some of your extracurriculars to spend more time focusing, and I say this because I am guilty of this myself. I overextend, and then I find it difficult to be able to do as well as I want to by no fault of anyone else's but myself. So I do think that there are certain things that we can do in medical school to ensure that people aren't falling behind before it's too late. But there's also ownership on the student to make sure that they're keeping up with what they need. And a big part that I also learned in my life, it is not inappropriate and it is not a sign of weakness to ask for help. Because too often, especially in medicine, we have this superhero mentality that we're not allowed to be struggling, we're not allowed to ask for help. And then oftentimes we feel as though we can't go to the same people that can help us because it will look like we don't know what we're doing. So.
Additional questions? Just simply raise your hand and we'll get a mic over to you. Again, you left them speechless. Thanks so much, Fermi. Oh, we got one? There we go. Lisa?
Hello, I'm not in medical school, but I'm a grad student, second year. Amazing talk. I just had a quick question about what you said in your talk. You said that you identified with many different identities, a black man, a medical student. How did you feel any type of like stereotypical threat to have to like represent all of those different identities? Any pressures to represent? And if you did, how did you overcome that?
Absolutely. So she asked if I felt any pressures to represent the multiple identities that I feel I have. And every single day. Because it's not even a pressure to do so, it's the fact that people are looking at me and doing so already. But that is something that should not be seen as a burden, because as I said, if you represent yourself well, you have no idea if someone's looking at you as a black man, if they're looking at you as a man with a disability, if they're looking at you as a physician, if they're looking at you as an ex-athlete. But either way, if I represent myself in a way that is going to reflect well on all of those identities, then I am universally bringing up the level of what people think of that type of person. And it's something I tell people to be true to yourself, right? And I'll bring up a specific case that I talk about, specifically in response to black men in medicine. Oftentimes, and my cousin actually just contacted me and asked me this question, you're often told that as you go through the interview trail that you should be clean-shaven, have a nice sort of unassuming haircut, and sort of toe the line, sort of status quo. And this is what I say to people. I say, if your hair is something that is so ingrained in who you are, and you feel as though you will be compromising your own integrity and your own personality by changing your hairstyle, then be your own person. However, you must acknowledge the fact that if you choose to wear long dreads to your general surgery interview, that you are going to be viewed as different. And that's just the fact. And if you're willing to accept that fact, and you feel as though that's something that's so important to you to do so, then fine, right? But that's where we are right now, in the sense that you have to acknowledge the realities of where we are, and then decide how you feel you want to address them. Now, I won't comment on whether that's fair or not right now, but that's where we are, okay? And it's not the same as selling out. It's not the same as being an Uncle Tom. It's emotional intelligence and realizing when is the right time to fight the system and when is the right time to stay in the system so that you can get to the top of the system and then change the system.
Thank you. Any other questions? There's one back there, Lisa. We'll take about two more, and I see one back here.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your presentation. I just have one question. What is one of, and I'm sure you've received a number of them, the greatest piece of advice or statement of wisdom that you have been able to glean from throughout your career that has helped you?
So she asked me, what's one piece of advice that I have been able to glean that has helped me? Now, the one piece of advice that I've been given is not something that was given to me directly by an individual, but it's the fact that I have faith. I have faith that the Lord has a plan for all of us. Now, that might not be an answer that fits for everyone, but that is the one thing for me that lets me know that I am not the one ultimately in control of what is going on. And therefore, it gives me a sense of peace to know that as long as I continue to have faith and to put all my cares on the Lord, that things will work out the way that they're meant to. That does not always mean that I'm going to get everything I want. That does not always mean that things are going to go the way I want them to. But that just means that there's an ultimate plan in place, and I have sort of a peace in knowing that that's the case.
Thank you so much. So we have one more question before we transition to our breakout sessions.
Thank you, Brian. My question is, how do you deal with racial bias in medicine? I was reading an article in New York Times last week where an Iranian doctor was seeing a patient, and the patient just had the comment that she must be a terrorist. A young black man went to see a patient, and the patient asked to see the real doctor. And he said, I am the doctor. And he said, okay, I need to see your supervisor. And the supervisor was also a black doctor. This happened in New York City. And so how do you deal with this kind of situation? Or what approach are you taking when you face this kind of situation?
So the question was, how do I deal with racial bias? An example of a patient saying that they didn't want to be cared for by a black doctor, or a patient saying to an Iranian doctor that he must be a terrorist. So that's a very delicate situation, and something that I have encountered multiple times, like in Dr. Twitty's book, and Black Man in a White Coat, when the teacher came and asked him what he's doing in his classroom. The number of times that I went to go take my patient to surgery, and I had been the same one to do the consent. I was the same one that pre-rounded on them that morning, but then when I came to take them to surgery, they thought that I was the transporter. And there's nothing wrong with being the transporter, but that's something that, watching my white male colleagues, if you're sitting around the cafeteria having conversation, they never report stories of getting mixed up for the transporters. And so the racial bias, the way that I manage that, there are times where it is overt and you have a patient that says, I don't want you taking care of me. I had a patient that said, they let you guys be doctors now? And it depends on how you want to handle it. I've always been one to handle things with comedy. And I say, well, no, I just slept in a Holiday Inn Express last night, not what you got. So, you know. But it depends, because what I choose to do is to not give them fuel for their ire, even though it's not right. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to be the one doing the surgery on you. And you want me to be the one, especially at teaching hospitals, when I'm going to be doing some simple procedure and the attending will be there for the critical portion of the case, of course. You don't want to get on my bad side. And so I talk to patients, and I think that when you have an honest conversation with someone, and this isn't going to work all the time, I know that. I'm not some sort of unrealistic idealist. But more often than not, when I take the time to talk to the patient and I explain what's going to happen, and I talk them through the surgery, or I talk them through what's going to, they realize this guy actually knows what he's talking about. And most often, especially when it's in medicine, it comes from a place of fear. And when the person all of a sudden feels comfortable with you because you've allayed their concerns for whatever the medical reason is why they're there, even the most racist of people, when they need something and they realize that you are the one that's going to provide it for them, they sometimes soften. And once again, I feel as though staying in the system to then become someone that is at the top of the system, to increase the numbers of people that are at the top of the system, will make it such that that behavior will not be seen as acceptable as much. And right now it's acceptable because there aren't enough people speaking out against it. There aren't enough good examples of people that you can point to show why that's not an acceptable statement to make. And so I think when we change that, one person at a time, that'll be the long-term way to address it. But my short-term way is with compassion, with comedy, and with patience.
Thank you so much. Again, a round of applause for our keynote.